The most powerful man in the city just got handed a note, and it could cost him his life. The atmosphere in the private back room of Goryeo barbecue is thick with the scent of charred ribeye and expensive scotch. Jun-ho sits at the head of the table, the picture of absolute authority in a charcoal grey tailored suit. To his right sits Min-soo, his shadow for 20 years, meticulously pouring a fresh glass of tea. The power in the room is palpable, until the heavy oak door creaks open. A young black man named Malik, wearing a damp hoodie and dark pants, steps into the room. He looks out of place, a jarring contrast to the polished marble and silent guards. He ignores the glares of the armed men at the door and walks straight to the head of the table. Min-soo reaches for his holster, but Jun-ho raises a hand, curious at the boy's sheer audacity. Malik doesn't say a word. He simply slides a small, folded piece of white paper across the table, his fingers trembling slightly as they touch the wood. Jun-ho unfolds the note with the steady hands of a surgeon, but as his eyes scan the jagged handwriting, his entire body goes rigid. His breath hitches. Across the table, Min-soo's calm, observing expression doesn't change, but his eyes narrow, tracking Jun-ho's pulse in his neck. The note reads, "Your right-hand man sold you to the triads. You aren't the guest tonight. You are the payment. Don't drink the tea." The clink of a spoon against a ceramic cup sounds like a gunshot in the sudden silence. Jun-ho is still the most powerful man in the city, but in this heartbeat, he is a man trapped in a cage of his own making, saved only by a boy he never would have looked at twice. Yo, if you're enjoying this story so far, make sure you hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the next one. Smash that like if the tension in this room got you on edge, and drop a comment. What would you do if you were in Jun-ho's shoes? And don't forget to share this with your friends, cause they gotta see this madness too. The air in the room seemed to vanish, leaving Jun-ho in a vacuum of suffocating silence. His thumb traced the edge of the folded paper, the texture of the cheap stationery feeling like sandpaper against his skin. Every instinct honed over decades of bloodshed screamed at him to reach for the pistol tucked into his waistband, but he didn't blink. He couldn't. Across the table, Min-soo tilted his head slightly, a gesture that had once seemed like loyal attentiveness, but now felt like a vulture circling a dying animal. The right-hand man's hand remained steady as he set the porcelain teapot down with a soft, final clink. "Bad news, Hyung-nim?" Min-soo asked. His voice was smooth, devoid of the tremor that was currently vibrating through the young messenger standing just a few feet away. Jun-ho felt the cold weight of the stone mask settle over his features. It was a facial expression he had perfected to intimidate rivals, a total erasure of emotion. He slowly refolded the note, tucking it into his breast pocket, right over his hammering heart. "A reminder from the foreman at the shipyard," Jun-ho lied, his voice sounding hauntingly normal even to his own ears. "It seems a particular shipment is arriving earlier than expected, a high-value payment that requires my personal signature." He caught the briefest flicker in Min-soo's eyes, a spark of predatory satisfaction. Min-soo knew, he knew exactly what that payment was. Jun-ho let his gaze drift past his friend, scanning the perimeter of the room. The two guards stationed at the door, men he had personally vetted, weren't looking at him. They were looking at the back of his head. Their stances had shifted, their weight was distributed on the balls of their feet, hands hovering inches from their holsters. The room, which had been his sanctuary 10 minutes ago, had transformed into a kill box. "Then we should toast to a successful delivery," Min-soo said, sliding the small ceramic cup of tea across the polished wood. The steam rose in a delicate, swirling ribbon, carrying the faint, floral scent of jasmine, and perhaps something sharper, something metallic. "Drink, it's your favorite." Jun-ho stared at the amber liquid. The note's warning echoed in his mind, "Don't drink the tea." He looked at Malik, the messenger. The boy was still there, his knuckles white as he gripped the straps of his backpack. Malik's eyes were darting toward the service bell on the wall. The boss didn't touch the cup. Instead, he leaned back, letting a thin, dangerous smile touch his lips. "I think I've lost my taste for tea tonight, Min-soo. I find myself suddenly craving something much more transformative." The untouched tea sat between them, a tiny ceramic lake of amber that represented the end of an era. Jun-ho could feel Min-soo's gaze, heavy, expectant, and sharp enough to draw blood. Every second that passed without Jun-ho taking a sip was a second that stripped away the pretense of their brotherhood. The air in the private room felt thick, like it was being pumped full of nitrogen, making every breath a conscious effort. Jun-ho reached out, but instead of picking up the cup, he adjusted the cuff of his charcoal jacket. It was a subtle movement, but it was also a signal. In the hierarchy of the Korean underworld, the Blue Pine Protocol was a series of silent gestures meant for emergencies. By rotating his watch face inward, he was signaling his guards to clear the room for a private security sweep. In any other scenario, his men would have bowed and stepped into the hallway instantly. This time, nobody moved. The two guards by the door remained like stone statues, their eyes fixed on the back of Jun-ho's head. The silence wasn't just quiet, it was deafening. It was the sound of an empire's foundation cracking. "The boys are tired, Hyung-nim," Min-soo said softly, his voice cutting through the tension like a razor. He leaned forward, the light from the overhead chandelier glinting off his slicked-back hair. "They've been standing all day, waiting for this moment. Why send them away when the guest of honor hasn't even finished his drink?" Jun-ho's jaw tightened. He finally looked Min-soo directly in the eyes. "I didn't realize my brothers had grown so hard of hearing, or perhaps they only listened to the man holding the ledger these days." Min-soo didn't flinch. Instead, he stood up slowly, his medium build casting a long, jagged shadow across the table. He didn't reach for a weapon, but he stepped to the side, physically anchoring himself between Jun-ho and the only visible exit. "Times are changing. Loyalty is a beautiful poem, Jun-ho, but it doesn't pay the debts you've ignored. You've become a relic. A very expensive, very valuable relic." Jun-ho felt the cold spike of adrenaline. He was trapped. He looked at Malik, who was still standing by the edge of the table. The boy was vibrating with a nervous energy, his dark skin shimmering with a thin layer of sweat. He looked terrified, yet there was a clarity in his eyes, the look of someone who lived in the cracks of the city and knew how to survive when the giants started fighting. Malik's gaze shifted from the boss to the red fire suppression lever tucked near the service station, then back to Jun-ho. Jun-ho gave a microscopic nod. In one fluid motion, Malik didn't just run, he exploded into action. He grabbed a heavy glass carafe of water from the side table and hurled it with pinpoint accuracy toward the kitchen's industrial stovetop, where a high-flame wok was being prepared. The glass shattered, the water hit the hot oil, and a massive, blinding plume of white steam and fire roared toward the ceiling. Simultaneously, Malik lunged for the fire alarm, slamming his palm against the glass. The piercing, rhythmic shriek of the alarm shattered the standoff. The overhead sprinklers hissed to life, drenching the $5,000 suits and the expensive barbecue in a cold, metallic deluge. The guards at the door hesitated for a fraction of a second, their training clashing with the sudden sensory overload. That was the 3-second window Jun-ho needed. He didn't go for the door. Instead, he vaulted over the table, his heavy leather shoes kicking the poisoned tea directly into Min-soo's face. As his traitorous right-hand man sputtered and wiped his eyes, Jun-ho grabbed Malik by the hood of his jacket, hauling him toward the service elevator hidden behind the decorative silkscreen. "The stairs," Malik yelled over the roar of the alarm. "The elevator is a cage." They dived through the service door just as the first suppressed gunshot thwacked into the wood behind them. The transition from the luxury of the dining room to the dim, grime-streaked concrete of the back stairwell was instantaneous. Jun-ho's heart hammered against his ribs, not with fear, but with the cold, lethal rhythm of a man who had just realized that to survive the night, he would have to burn his world to the ground. The heavy steel door of the service exit clattered shut behind them, sealing away the shriek of the fire alarm, but the silence that followed was far more terrifying. It was a thick, predatory quiet, broken only by the frantic slap of their shoes against the damp concrete of the stairwell. Jun-ho's lungs burned, a sharp reminder that his life had been spent behind mahogany desks and in the back of armored limousines, not sprinting down graffiti-streaked service corridors. Water from the overhead sprinklers still clung to his tailored suit, making the fabric heavy and cold, like a shroud beginning to wrap around his frame. "This way, stay low," Malik hissed, his voice a jagged whisper that echoed off the peeling yellow paint of the walls. The boy didn't hesitate. He moved with a feline grace, his dark hoodie pulled tight, disappearing into the shadows of the landings before Jun-ho could even find his footing. They reached the ground floor, bursting through a set of swinging double doors into the restaurant's industrial kitchen. It was a chaotic landscape of stainless steel and abandoned prep stations. Steam still rose from the woks Malik had sabotaged, creating a low-hanging fog that smelled of burnt soy and ozone. Jun-ho's hand instinctively went to his waist, his fingers curling around the cold grip of his suppressed pistol. He caught his reflection in the side of a walk-in freezer, a powerful man reduced to a fugitive, his slicked-back hair falling across his forehead in damp, silver-black strands. Suddenly the sound hit them, the rhythmic, tactical thud of boots hitting the stairs they had just descended. It wasn't the frantic pace of a mob, it was the measured, synchronized heartbeat of a professional hit squad. Minsu's personal detail. Men Junho had paid for, trained, and trusted to be his shield were now the swords leveled at his throat. Outside now, Malik urged, grabbing the sleeve of Junho's jacket and pulling him toward a narrow, unremarkable door tucked behind a mountain of plastic crates. They tumbled out into the night air, but there was no relief. They had emerged into the concrete labyrinth, a suffocating network of narrow alleys that served as the city's digestive system. Towering brick buildings leaned in from both sides, blotting out the moon and leaving only the sickly orange glow of distant streetlights to filter through the haze. Piles of trash and rusted dumpsters created a jagged obstacle course, and the ground was slick with a cocktail of rainwater and oil. Malik took a hard left, then a sudden right, weaving through the darkness with a confidence that bordered on the supernatural. To Junho, the alleys were a blur of brick and shadow, a trap designed to swallow him whole. To Malik, they were a map. "They're behind us," Junho breathed, stopping for a half-second to listen. The sound of the kitchen door hitting the wall echoed through the alley. No shouting, no commands, just the cold, metallic slide of bolts being drawn back. They were being hunted by professionals who didn't need to talk. "I know," Malik whispered, his eyes wide and bright with adrenaline, "but they only know the main veins, they don't know the capillaries. Follow my feet, boss. If you lose sight of my hood, you're a dead man." They plunged deeper into the maze. They climbed over a chain-link fence, the rusted wire snagging Junho's sleeve, tearing the expensive wool like paper. He didn't care. The sting of the cold air in his throat and the adrenaline surging through his veins were the only things that felt real. Behind them, a flashlight beam cut through the dark, sweeping across the brickwork just inches from where they had been standing a moment before. The weight of the betrayal finally began to settle in Junho's chest, heavier than the water in his clothes. Every turn in this labyrinth was a reminder of how far he had fallen from his throne. He was a king in a suit, being led to safety by a boy in a hoodie, through the very filth he had spent his life trying to rise above. "Quiet," Malik suddenly commanded, pulling Junho into a recessed doorway that smelled of damp cardboard and old rain. They pressed themselves against the cold stone, their breaths coming in shallow, synchronized hitches. A few yards away, the heavy silhouette of a gunman passed the opening of the alcove. The light from the man's tactical vest glinted off the barrel of a submachine gun. Junho held his breath, his finger tightening on his own trigger, ready to sell his life dearly. He looked at Malik. The boy was trembling, his eyes squeezed shut, but he didn't make a sound. The footsteps faded, moving toward the main thoroughfare. Malik waited a beat, then another, before exhaling a breath he seemed to have been holding since the restaurant. "The docks are 6 blocks that way," Malik pointed into a darkness that looked impenetrable. "But we can't take the streets. We stay in the shadows, we stay in the dirt. That's the only way we make it to the morning." Junho nodded, the stone mask of his expression finally cracking to reveal a grim, newfound respect. He realized then that in this concrete labyrinth his money was paper and his name was a ghost. Only the boy and the shadows were real. The heavy corrugated door of a rusted shipping container groaned as Malik slid it just wide enough for them to slip inside. The interior smelled of salt, old iron and damp earth. As the door clicked shut, plunging them into a heavy velvet darkness, the muffled sounds of the city, sirens, the distant hum of tires on wet asphalt, seemed to belong to a different world. Junho sank against the cold metal wall, his legs finally giving out. The adrenaline that had carried him through the labyrinth was receding, leaving behind a bone-deep ache and the stinging heat of a graze on his shoulder he hadn't noticed until now. He looked at Malik, who was huddled near the door, peering through a small rust hole at the moonlit yard outside. The boy's silhouette was small, his shoulders shaking with the delayed onset of shock. "Why?" Junho's voice was a low rasp cutting through the darkness. "You could have stayed in the shadows. You could have let the payment happen and gone home to a quiet life. Why risk your neck for a man like me?" Malik didn't turn around immediately. He stayed frozen for a moment before slowly sliding his hoodie back, revealing his face in the sliver of light filtering through the hole. His expression wasn't one of a hero. It was the look of someone who had been backed into a corner by a predator. "You think this is about you?" Malik whispered, his voice trembling but sharp. "I don't care about your throne or your suits, boss. I care about my mother. I care about the 3 blocks of the south side where the streetlights actually work because you kept the local gangs out." He finally turned to face Junho, his eyes bright with a mixture of fear and fury. The note didn't just say Minsu sold you. I heard him talking to the rivals at the community center he's been trying to buy. The payment for his debt isn't just your life, it's the deeds to the Southside housing. He's handing our neighborhood over to the syndicate to be leveled for their new docks. If you die tonight, my home is gone by morning. The revelation hit Junho harder than the betrayal itself. He had always viewed his protection of the neighborhood as a business expense, a way to keep his territory quiet. He had never considered that the people living there saw him as a shield. Minsu wasn't just killing a man, he was liquidating a community. Junho looked at his hands, the hands of a man who had built an empire on blood. For the first time, the stone mask didn't just crack, it fell away. He saw the boy not as a messenger, but as the only person in the city who was actually fighting for something worth saving. He wants to burn it all to pay for his pride, Junho said softly, reaching out to steady himself against the vibrating metal wall. Then we don't just survive, Malik, we make sure the transaction fails. Outside, the sound of a heavy engine rumbled nearby. A spotlight swept across the container's exterior, the light leaking through the gaps like burning needles. Minsu was close. Junho checked his magazine, 3 rounds left. He looked at Malik, seeing the boy's terror, and felt a new, unfamiliar weight in his chest. He wasn't just protecting his legacy anymore. He was protecting the only bridge he had left to the living world. The Blue Rose was a nondescript apartment on the 14th floor of a luxury high-rise, a ghost unit registered to a defunct textile company. To the world it didn't exist. To Junho it was the final sanctuary, stocked with untraceable cash, burner phones, and a small arsenal. As the elevator ascended, the digital numbers ticking upward felt like a countdown to safety. My best men are here, Junho whispered, leaning his head against the cool, mirrored wall of the elevator. His stone mask was back, though it was chipped and weary. Jae-hoon and Sang-woo, I pulled them from the orphanage myself 15 years ago. They don't answer to the organization, they answer to me. Malik stayed silent, his thumb nervously picking at a loose thread on his hoodie. He didn't know anything about Mafia orphans or lifelong debts. He only knew the weight of the handgun Junho had tucked into his own waistband. The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime. The hallway was silent, the plush carpet muffling their footsteps. At the end of the corridor, 2 men in sharp black suits stood guard outside Unit 14B. When they saw Junho, they didn't reach for their weapons. They bowed, low and respectful. Hyung Nim, Jae-hoon said, his voice steady. We heard there was trouble at the restaurant, we've been waiting. Junho felt a wave of relief so sharp it was almost painful. He stepped forward, gesturing for Malik to follow. The inner circle has collapsed. Minsu is the architect. We need to regroup, get the offshore codes and... Junho stopped. He was 3 feet away from Jae-hoon, close enough to see the man's eyes. Jae-hoon wasn't looking at Junho's face. He was looking at the bruised, blood-stained shoulder of his jacket. There was no pity in that look. There was only the cold, calculating gaze of a butcher weighing a piece of meat. Where is Sang-woo? Junho asked, his hand drifting toward his side. Inside, Jae-hoon replied. He didn't move to open the door. He's on the phone with the new chairman. The air in the hallway turned to ice. The new chairman, the title hadn't existed an hour ago. Minsu hadn't just sold Junho, he had already inaugurated himself. How much? Junho asked, his voice a low, dangerous growl. More than a memory was worth, Jae-hoon said. In a heartbeat, the sanctuary became a slaughterhouse. Jae-hoon lunged not for a gun but for a combat knife hidden in his sleeve, aiming for Junho's throat. Junho pivoted, his older joints popping with the effort, and parried the blow with his forearm. Behind them, the apartment door swung open, and Sang-woo emerged, his suppressed pistol raised. Get down, Junho roared, shoving Malik toward the floor as a bullet, zip-thudded, into the drywall where the boy's head had been a second before. Junho didn't think, he reacted. He drew his own weapon and fired 2 rounds. The first caught Sang-woo in the shoulder, spinning him back into the apartment. The second missed Jae-hoon as the younger man tackled Junho into the wall. They crashed against the mirrors, glass shattering into 1,000 shimmering diamonds. Junho felt a sharp sting in his side. The knife had found a gap in his ribs. Gritting his teeth, he slammed his forehead into Jae-hoon's nose, feeling the cartilage break. As the guard stumbled, Junho didn't finish him. He couldn't. He grabbed Malik's arm and dragged him back toward the emergency stairwell, the Blue Rose, now just another blood-stained room in a city that had turned its back on its king. The rain had turned from a drizzle into a punishing downpour, by the time they reached the bowels of an abandoned subway maintenance station 3 miles from the Blue Rose. Jun-ho leaned against a rusted electrical box, his breath coming in ragged, wet hitches. He pressed a hand to his side, feeling the warm, sticky flow of blood through the tatters of his white shirt. The $5,000 suit was a rag now, stained with grease and the betrayal of the men he had called sons. He pulled out his primary phone, a custom encrypted device that cost more than a mid-sized car, and watched the signal bar. It was full, but the screen flickered with a strange, red icon, a remote override. Min-soo hadn't just taken his men, he had taken the very air Jun-ho breathed in the digital world. "They're tracking the IMEI, Jun-ho whispered, the realization hitting him with the force of a physical blow. "Every tower I ping is a flare for the hit squad. My bank accounts, my contacts, my history. It's all been turned into a GPS for my own execution." He looked at the device, a symbol of his absolute power, and with a sudden, violent motion, smashed it against the concrete floor. The screen shattered, the glowing light dying instantly. In that moment, the Korean Mafia boss died with it. He was no longer a king, he was a ghost. Malik watched him from the shadows of a tunnel archway, his face unreadable. Without a word, the boy reached into his backpack and pulled out a small, plastic-wrapped object. He tossed it to Jun-ho. It was a burner, a cheap, clunky flip phone with a cracked casing. Beside it, Malik dropped a folded, neon-orange windbreaker with a local delivery service logo on the back. "Put that on," Malik commanded. His voice had lost its tremor. In this darkness, among the damp smells of mildew and cold steel, Malik was the one in his element. "Your face is on every high-def camera in the city, but nobody looks at the guy delivering fried chicken at 2:00 a.m. In my world, being invisible is better than being powerful." Jun-ho looked at the neon jacket. It was the ultimate in dignity, a garment that represented everything he had looked down upon. But as the sound of a distant siren echoed down the maintenance shaft, he realized Malik was right. His old world was a burning house, and the only way out was through the mud. He slid the jacket over his bloodied shirt, the cheap nylon hissing against the silk. He flipped open the burner phone. There were no names in the contact list, only a series of 7-digit numbers scribbled on a piece of cardboard tucked into the battery cover. "Who are these people?" Jun-ho asked. "People who don't care about the Korean Mafia," Malik said, stepping into the dim light of a flickering overhead bulb. "They care about the neighborhood. They're the eyes on the street that your intelligence network never bothered to count. If we're going to stop Min-soo, we stop him from the bottom up." Jun-ho gripped the cheap phone, his knuckles white. He was officially off the grid. The king was gone, and in his place stood a man in a delivery jacket, ready to learn the language of the shadows. The scent of brine and industrial decay hung heavy over Pier 42. It was a graveyard of rusted cranes and hollowed-out warehouses, a place where the city's secrets were traditionally buried in concrete and tossed into the black depths of the harbor. This was the designated site for the payment. Here, Min-soo would hand over the physical deeds to the south side and the broken body of his former mentor to the rival syndicate, cementing his rise to power. Jun-ho stood in the shadow of a leaning stack of shipping containers, the neon-orange delivery jacket now smudged with soot and grease. He looked nothing like a king. To a casual observer, he was just another late-night worker caught in the rain. Beside him, Malik was hunched over the burner phone, his thumbs flying across the keypad. "The delivery network is in position," Malik whispered, his breath visible in the cold air. 3 bikes on the north perimeter, 2 cars blocking the service road. They've been tracking the syndicate's black sedans since they left the Uptown Hotel. Min-soo thinks he's moving in silence, but every kid with a delivery app is watching him breathe. Jun-ho nodded, his eyes fixed on the center of the pier, a cleared circle illuminated by a single, flickering halogen lamp. He felt a strange, cold clarity. For years he had operated with a private army and high-tech surveillance, yet he had been blindsided. Now, with nothing but a group of neighborhood kids and a cheap plastic phone, he felt more in control than ever. He wasn't relying on bought loyalty, he was relying on the survival instinct of a community. "The crates at the center are rigged," Jun-ho asked, his voice a low, melodic rasp. "Just like you said," Malik replied. "We tapped into the port's gas lines. One spark from that burner phone's frequency and this whole pier becomes a furnace. But you have to be in the center of it for the trap to work. You're the bait, boss." "I have been the payment all night, Malik," Jun-ho said, checking the weight of the handgun in his pocket. "It's time to see if Min-soo can afford the price." Suddenly, the low rumble of engines vibrated through the concrete. 4 black sedans crested the rise of the pier, their headlights cutting through the fog like the eyes of deep-sea predators. They moved in a tactical diamond formation, coming to a synchronized halt 20 yards from the halogen lamp. The doors opened simultaneously. Men in dark suits, Jun-ho's own former guards, stepped out, forming a perimeter. Finally, the rear door of the lead car opened. Min-soo stepped out, holding a leather briefcase. He looked around the desolate pier, a smug, triumphant smile playing on his lips. He was seconds away from becoming the most powerful man in the city. Jun-ho stepped out from the shadows of the containers, the orange of his jacket a defiant splash of color against the grey rot of the docks. He walked toward the light, his hands empty, his head held high. "You're late, Min-soo," Jun-ho called out, his voice carrying over the wind. "I hope you brought the receipt. A debt this large is hard to settle in the dark." Min-soo froze, his smile faltering as he stared at the man he thought was a ghost. The rain intensified, turning the shipyard into a blurred landscape of steel and water. Min-soo stood frozen for a beat, his grip tightening on the briefcase before he erupted into a jagged, mocking laugh. "Look at you," Min-soo sneered, gesturing at Jun-ho's neon delivery jacket. "The great lion of Seoul dressed like a street rat. You really think coming here yourself changes the math? You're not a player anymore, Jun-ho. You're just a line item I'm about to cross out." Min-soo signaled with a sharp flick of his wrist. 2 hitmen stepped forward, their silenced weapons leveled at Jun-ho's chest. Jun-ho didn't flinch. He remained under the flickering halogen light, the water cascading off his brow like tears of ice. "I spent 20 years teaching you how to read a room, Min-soo," Jun-ho said, his voice terrifyingly calm. "But you forgot to look at the shadows. You sold the South Side to pay your debt, but you forgot that the South Side owns the ground you're standing on." As if on cue, the silence of the docks was shattered. From the dark periphery, dozens of engines roared to life, not the heavy purr of luxury sedans, but the high-pitched, angry whine of delivery scooters and beat-up mopeds. Headlights cut through the fog from every direction, circling the pier like a pack of wolves. Min-soo's men spun around, confused, their tactical advantage evaporating as they were blinded by the crisscrossing beams of 50 different lights. "What is this?" Min-soo hissed, his composure finally breaking. "This is the neighborhood coming to collect," Jun-ho replied. Malik's voice crackled over the pier's old PA system, amplified by a megaphone. "The gas is open, Min-soo. Drop the case and step away from the boss, or we turn this pier into a sun." Panic flared in the traitor's eyes. They could smell it now, the sharp, sweet scent of natural gas hissing from the ruptured lines beneath the concrete. Min-soo, driven by a desperate terminal greed, pulled a chrome revolver from his waistband. "If I'm going down, I'm taking the crown with me." He fired. Jun-ho dove behind a heavy iron bollard just as the bullets sparked against the metal. In the same motion, Jun-ho drew his own weapon, the cheap burner phone Malik had given him. He didn't pull a trigger, he hit send on a pre-dialed number. A muffled explosion rocked the north end of the pier as a small gas pocket ignited, sending a wall of fire 10 feet into the air. The distraction was enough. Jun-ho lunged from behind the bollard, tackling Min-soo into the slick, oily mud. They fought like animals, stripped of the dignity of their suits and titles. It was a messy, visceral struggle for survival. Min-soo swung the briefcase like a club, but Jun-ho, fueled by a cold, righteous fury, caught his arm and twisted. The bone snapped with a sickening wet pop. Min-soo screamed, the sound lost in the roar of the fire and the rain. Jun-ho pinned him to the ground, his forearm pressed against Min-soo's throat. The stone mask was gone, replaced by the face of a man who had seen the bottom of the world and climbed back up. "You told the rivals I was the payment," Jun-ho growled, staring into Min-soo's terrified eyes. "But I've decided to renegotiate. You're the one who's overdrawn, Min-soo, and your time is up." The fire from the ruptured gas line roared into the blackened sky, casting a hellish, dancing orange glow over the rain-slicked concrete. Min-soo lay gasping in the mud, his face contorted in a mask of agony and disbelief. The leather briefcase containing the future of the South Side sat just inches away, splattered with sludge. Around the perimeter, the circle of delivery scooters stayed firm, their headlights pinning the remaining traitors in place like insects under a microscope. Jun-ho stood over his former brother, his chest heaving. He looked down at Min-soo, not with the cold detachment of a boss, but with the profound weariness of a man who had finally seen the rot at the heart of his own empire. "You always thought I was soft because I protected the neighborhood. Junho said, his voice low and raspy, carrying over the hiss of the rain. You thought it was a weakness to be tied to the people. You wanted to be a king of ghosts, Minsu. You wanted power without the burden of the people who actually build the city. Minsu spat blood, a jagged, pathetic laugh escaping his lips. The people, they're nothing but insects, Junho. You're dying for a slum, and a boy who doesn't even know your real name. He knows enough, Junho replied. He looked toward the shadows where Malik stood, the young man's face pale but resolute. He knows that a note is worth more than a life if the person holding it has the courage to deliver it. Junho reached down and picked up the briefcase. He didn't open it. He didn't need to. He walked to the edge of the pier where the dark, churning waters of the harbour slapped against the rusted pilings. With a single, powerful heave, he threw the leather case, and the millions of dollars in deeds and contracts it held, into the abyss. It vanished into the black waves without a trace. The south side belongs to no one now, Junho declared, turning back to the terrified guards who were still held at bay by Malik's street network. The debt is cancelled. The payment is void. He turned his attention back to Minsu. The traitor was trying to crawl away, his broken arm dragging behind him in the dirt. Junho didn't reach for his gun. He didn't need to finish it himself. The rival syndicate's black sedans had already begun to reverse, their headlights disappearing into the fog. They wouldn't touch a man who had no assets, no organization, and no loyalty left to sell. Minsu was a dead man walking. The underworld would swallow him long before the sun rose. Junho walked over to Malik. The boy looked at the Mafia boss, the man who was now dressed in a ruined delivery jacket, his face cut and his pride stripped bare. Is it over? Malik asked, his voice trembling with the weight of the night. The old story is over, Junho said. He reached out and placed a heavy, steady hand on Malik's shoulder. But you told me the neighborhood needs a shield, not a king, not a boss, a shield. In the weeks that followed, the Korean Mafia didn't return to its gilded towers. Junho stayed in the south side. He traded his tailored suits for dark, inconspicuous jackets. He used his remaining hidden resources not to rebuild a criminal empire, but to fund the very community centers and housing projects Minsu had tried to destroy. He was still a dangerous man, and the shadows still feared him, but he no longer ruled from a throne. He ruled from the street corners, from the back of ramen shops, and from the very alleys Malik had led him through. Malik became his eyes and ears, the first of a new kind of inner circle that valued the truth of a hand-delivered note over the lies of a blood brother. The payment had been settled. Junho had lost his empire, but he had found his soul in the hands of a boy who dared to speak the truth. As the sun finally broke over the harbour, Junho looked at the city and realized he was finally, for the first time in his life, a powerful man, not because of what he owned, but because of who he protected. Whoa, if that had you on the edge of your seat, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss the next insane story. Hit that like button if you felt the tension in that room, and comment below, what would you have done if you were Junho? And don't forget to share this with your friends, cause they need to see this crazy twist too.